For over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, an empire calling itself Roman still stood, speaking Greek, worshipping as Orthodox Christians, and ruling from a city that had once been a Greek colony. It endured plagues, invasions, civil wars, and crusaders. It outlasted kingdoms, witnessed the rise of Islam, and guarded the legacy of antiquity through an age of fire and transformation. How did the Eastern Roman Empire survive when its western half collapsed? What held it together for so long, and what finally brought it down? This is the entire story of the Eastern Roman Empire. Let's begin. In the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire was teetering on the edge of collapse. After a long period of internal turmoil, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome had seen over 20 emperors rise and fall in just 50 years. Civil war, economic instability, and relentless invasions from outside forces had brought the empire to a breaking point. It was no longer clear whether it could continue to function as a unified state. Into this chaos stepped a man named Diocletian. Born to a family of humble origins in the Roman province of Dalmatia, he rose through the military ranks during the turbulent years of the 3rd century. By the year 285, Diocletian had declared himself emperor after defeating his rival Carinus. But unlike many of his predecessors, Diocletian did not attempt to rule in the traditional mold of a single, all-powerful Roman emperor. He understood that the empire had grown too large, too complex, and too vulnerable to govern alone. Diocletian's solution was radical. He divided the empire. Rather than split the empire in half permanently, Diocletian established what he called the tetrarchy, government by 4. In this new arrangement, the empire would be ruled by 2 senior emperors, known as Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, known as Caesars. Diocletian took the eastern half for himself and appointed Maximian to govern the west. Together, they each selected a subordinate to assist them and eventually succeed them. This was more than a bureaucratic fix. It marked a major shift in how the Roman world was organized. By creating a structure where multiple emperors ruled different regions simultaneously, Diocletian hoped to bring stability to the imperial system, improve military response times, and reduce the constant power struggles that had plagued Rome for decades. Though the tetrarchy did not survive long after Diocletian retired in the early 4th century, its impact was lasting. The division it created between East and West began to solidify. The eastern and western halves of the empire began to develop along different paths, culturally, administratively, and politically. The next major milestone came with the rise of Constantine the Great. Constantine, the son of Constantius Chlorus, one of the original Caesars in Diocletian's tetrarchy, emerged as a central figure in the early 4th century. After years of civil war among rival claimants to imperial power, Constantine defeated his last major opponent, Licinius, in the year 324. This made him the sole ruler of the empire. Constantine's reign introduced profound changes. Perhaps his most famous act was his conversion to Christianity, a religion that had previously faced periodic persecution under earlier emperors. Constantine's embrace of Christianity and his decision to legalize it through the Edict of Milan in the year 313 set the stage for the transformation of the Roman religious landscape. Over the next decades, Christianity would grow from a tolerated faith into the dominant religion of the empire. But Constantine's most lasting decision, in terms of Eastern Roman history, was to found a new imperial capital in the east. In the year 330, Constantine officially dedicated the city of Constantinople, built on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. Located on the Bosporus Strait, this city occupied a strategic position between Europe and Asia, with access to key trade routes and natural defenses. Constantine intended it to serve as a new Rome, a center of administration, commerce, and imperial authority in the eastern provinces. The founding of Constantinople was not just a practical move. It was symbolic. It signaled a shift in the empire's center of gravity. While Rome remained culturally and historically significant, it was no longer the uncontested seat of imperial power. With Constantinople rising in prominence, the East began to take on a stronger identity of its own. Over the next few decades, The division between East and West deepened, especially after Constantine's death in the year 337. His sons and successors fought over control of the empire, further fragmenting it. Although attempts were made to reunify the empire, the practical realities of administration and defense continued to favor a divided system. In the year 395, the division became permanent. Following the death of Emperor Theodosius I, often considered the last emperor to rule both the eastern and western halves of the Roman Empire, a formal split took place. Theodosius had divided the empire between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. From this point forward, there would be two separate imperial courts, two capitals, and increasingly, two distinct political cultures. The Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople, was wealthier, more urbanized, and more secure than its western counterpart. It had older cities, stronger fortifications, and more stable access to trade. Meanwhile, the Western Empire, governed from Ravenna and later Milan, struggled with declining resources, frontier instability, and frequent invasions by Germanic tribes. But while the West would eventually collapse under the weight of these pressures, the East would survive, and even thrive, for centuries. The seeds of this divergence were planted during the administrative reforms of Diocletian and the bold founding of Constantinople by Constantine. What began as a practical division for governance had, by the late 4th century, evolved into the birth of a distinct Eastern Roman identity. This new empire would preserve the legal, cultural, and religious heritage of Rome while adapting it to a changing world. As the Western Roman Empire moved toward disintegration in the late 4th and 5th centuries, its eastern counterpart, centered in Constantinople, was learning how to adapt and survive. The story of the Eastern Roman Empire in this period is not only one of endurance, but of growing self-definition. While the western half crumbled under relentless pressure, the East stabilized, fortified, and laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the Byzantine civilization. The formal division of the empire in the year 395 placed Arcadius on the eastern throne and his brother Honorius in the west. Honorius faced immediate crises: economic decay, military weakness, and increasing pressure from Germanic groups. Rome itself, long unchallenged, would soon be shaken to its core. In the year 410, the city of Rome was sacked by the Visigoths under their king, Alaric. It was the first time Rome had fallen to a foreign enemy in over 800 years. The psychological blow was immense. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, described the event in despair. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. But the Eastern Empire, though shocked, was not paralyzed. At this time, the Eastern court under Arcadius, and later his son Theodosius II, focused on preserving internal order and managing external threats with diplomacy as well as military strength. Constantinople was better protected than Rome, thanks in part to its geography and also to the construction of the Theodosian walls, a vast system of defensive fortifications built during the reign of Theodosius II in the early 5th century. These walls, completed by the year 413, would be tested many times in the centuries to come. Triple-layered with towers, moats, and stone ramparts, they turned Constantinople into one of the most fortified cities in the world. While Rome burned, Constantinople was building. Meanwhile, in the West, the imperial system was unraveling. Rival generals, weak emperors, and shifting allegiances left the Western Roman Empire increasingly vulnerable. The Eastern emperors observed from a distance, often providing minimal support but rarely intervening directly. They had their own problems to manage. One of the most formidable threats came not from within the empire, but from across the steppe: the Huns. Under the leadership of Attila, the Huns surged into Eastern Europe and posed a terrifying threat to both halves of the empire. Attila launched a campaign against the Eastern Roman Empire in the 440s, raiding the Balkans and forcing the imperial government to pay heavy tributes to avoid destruction. The Eastern court, under Emperor Theodosius II, reluctantly paid these tributes while also trying to build alliances and defenses. This policy of buying time worked. When Attila turned his attention westward in the late 440s, invading Gaul and northern Italy, The East was spared further devastation. The West, however, was further weakened by this onslaught. In the year 453, Attila died unexpectedly. Without his leadership, the Hunnic threat rapidly declined. The Eastern Empire, though battered, emerged intact. The West, now without effective leadership or military strength, was nearing collapse. During these decades, a new emperor rose in the East, Leo I, crowned in the year 457. Leo marked a turning point. Unlike his predecessors, who were often selected or heavily influenced by powerful generals of barbarian origin, Leo was chosen with the backing of the Eastern Roman Senate and took steps to assert imperial authority independently. He was the first Eastern Roman emperor to be crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople, a symbolic gesture that underscored the growing connection between the imperial office and the Orthodox Church. Leo's reign was also notable for military reforms and efforts to assert Eastern influence in the West. He supported a military expedition to reclaim North Africa from the Vandals, who had seized the province and were using it as a base to raid Roman territories. This expedition, led by the general Basiliscus, ended in disaster in the year 468, weakening the empire's resources and credibility. Despite this failure, Leo's rule helped consolidate Eastern administration and strengthen the internal apparatus of the empire. By the time of his death in the year 474, the Eastern Empire had stabilized. The same could not be said for the West. In the Western Empire, power increasingly shifted to military strongmen of non-Roman origin. By the mid-5th century, figures like Ricimer, a general of Germanic descent, held the real power behind the throne. Western emperors came and went, many of them mere puppets. The final blow came in the year 476. A Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, and declared himself ruler of Italy. Odoacer did not claim the title of emperor. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, formally acknowledging the Eastern emperor, Zeno, as the sole ruler of the Roman world. This gesture was symbolic. Though the West had collapsed politically, the Eastern Roman Empire had survived. From its perspective, the Roman Empire had not ended. It had simply contracted. In Constantinople, the Eastern court did not immediately seek to reclaim the Western provinces. Zeno, occupied with his own internal revolts and rival claimants to power, played a cautious diplomatic game. He recognized Odoacer's rule in Italy while maintaining the fiction of a united empire under Eastern leadership. Meanwhile, the idea of Rome began to take on a new shape in the East. The culture, language, and religion of the Eastern Roman Empire were evolving. Greek was now the dominant administrative and cultural language, replacing Latin in many contexts. Christianity was fully embedded in state ideology, with imperial authority and church leadership increasingly intertwined. The survival of the Eastern Roman Empire through the fall of the West was not accidental. It was the result of geography, stronger urban infrastructure, better economic foundations, and more cohesive leadership. Constantinople's location made it easier to defend and maintain contact with prosperous trade networks in Asia Minor and the Eastern Mediterranean. Its wealth allowed it to fund large armies, maintain fortifications, and weather crises more effectively than Rome ever could in its final years. But survival did not mean immunity. The East remained under constant threat from external forces and internal disputes. The Gothic Wars, religious controversies, and court intrigues would continue to challenge the empire's stability. In the early 6th century, the Eastern Roman Empire stood alone as the heir to Roman tradition. It had weathered the fall of the West and survived a century of external threats and internal challenges. Now, under the rule of a single ambitious emperor, it would attempt something extraordinary, an imperial restoration of Rome's former glory. That emperor was Justinian. Justinian was born in the late 5th century in a region called Dardania in the Balkans. He was not of noble birth. His family were peasants, and his native language was likely Latin, though he would be educated in Greek and Roman traditions. His rise to power was made possible by his uncle Justin, a career soldier who rose through the ranks and was eventually crowned emperor in the year 518. Justinian was adopted as Justin's heir and formally became emperor in the year 527. From the beginning of his reign, Justinian's ambitions were clear. He saw himself not merely as the ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, but as the restorer of Roman greatness. In his view, the empire had been broken but not lost. The West, Italy, North Africa, and even parts of Spain were all rightful territories of Rome, temporarily in the hands of barbarian usurpers. His goal was to reclaim them. To support this vision, Justinian relied on a small circle of capable and loyal advisors. Chief among them was his wife, Theodora. She had come from a humble background and had once worked as an actress, a profession considered disreputable at the time. Despite this, Justinian made her empress, and she quickly proved to be one of his most trusted and intelligent partners in rule. Theodora played a key role in shaping imperial policy and stood firm during crises that might have destroyed weaker regimes. Another indispensable figure was Belisarius, Justinian's most skilled general. Belisarius had already proven himself in earlier conflicts, and he would become the central military leader in Justinian's campaigns to reclaim the western provinces. But Justinian's ambitions extended beyond the battlefield. One of his earliest and most enduring legacies was legal reform. Roman law had grown vast and unwieldy over the centuries, with contradictory edicts and scattered interpretations. Justinian commissioned a comprehensive legal codification known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, or Body of Civil Law. Completed in stages between 529 and 534, this legal work became the foundation of Byzantine law and would later influence legal systems in medieval Europe and beyond. While legal reform shaped the internal workings of the empire, Justinian turned his attention to external conquest. His first major target was North Africa, which had been under Vandal control since the early 5th century. In the year 533, Belisarius launched a swift and well-coordinated campaign against the Vandals. Within a matter of months, the Byzantine forces defeated the Vandal king, Gelimer, and reasserted imperial authority over the province. This success emboldened Justinian to move against Italy, which was then under the rule of the Ostrogoths. The Gothic War, however, would prove far more difficult and drawn out. Beginning in 535, the conflict stretched for nearly 2 decades. Belisarius captured Rome and several key cities early in the campaign, but the Ostrogoths regrouped and launched fierce counterattacks. At one point, Rome changed hands multiple times. Despite several changes in command and shifting fortunes, the Byzantines eventually emerged victorious. In the year 553, a second general, Narses, led a renewed campaign that decisively defeated the Goths. By 554, Italy was once again under imperial control, at least in name. However, the cost of these conquests was enormous. Italy had been devastated by prolonged warfare, cities were ruined, agricultural production collapsed, and local populations were displaced. The Byzantines had regained territory, but it came at the price of economic exhaustion and ongoing resistance from local populations who no longer saw Constantinople as a distant protector, but as a foreign ruler. While Italy was still being contested, Justinian also turned his gaze toward the Iberian Peninsula. A limited campaign in southern Spain succeeded in capturing a few coastal cities from the Visigoths around 552. Though minor compared to the wars in Africa and Italy, this move reflected Justinian's broader strategy, reclaiming as much of the former Roman world as possible. All the while, Justinian was also engaged in the East. His empire faced constant tension with the Sassanid Persian Empire. The two powers had long been rivals, and periodic wars flared up throughout Justinian's reign. Though he eventually negotiated a 50-year peace with Persia in 561, the eastern frontier remained a source of military strain. While Justinian's military efforts stretched the empire's limits, he was also reshaping the cultural and architectural landscape of Constantinople. His most iconic project was the rebuilding of the Hagia Sophia. After the original structure was destroyed during the Nika riots in 532, Justinian commissioned a new basilica on a grander scale than ever before. The Nika riots themselves had nearly ended his reign. Sparked by discontent with imperial policies and abuses by officials, the riots began as a public protest during chariot races at the Hippodrome. They quickly escalated into a full-scale revolt. Much of the city was burned, and imperial authority hung in the balance. Justinian considered fleeing, but Theodora is said to have refused. According to later sources, she told him, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud," convincing him to stay and fight. Belisarius and another general, Mundus, were called in to suppress the rebellion. In a brutal crackdown, imperial forces slaughtered tens of thousands of rioters in the Hippodrome. The rebellion was crushed, and Justinian's authority restored. In the aftermath, Justinian poured resources into rebuilding the capital. The Hagia Sophia was completed in less than 6 years and stood as a symbol of imperial power and divine favor. Its massive dome, intricate mosaics, and luminous interior would become a hallmark of Byzantine architecture and a model for centuries to come. Yet for all his achievements, Justinian's reign was not without deep costs and long-term consequences. His wars drained the treasury and left large areas of the empire vulnerable. His centralization of power alienated segments of the aristocracy and provincial elites. Even his legal and religious policies stirred controversy, especially as he attempted to enforce orthodoxy and suppress heretical views, such as monophysitism, which remained popular in Egypt and Syria. And then came the plague. Around the year 541, a devastating pandemic, now known as the Plague of Justinian, swept through the empire. It is believed to have been an early outbreak of bubonic plague. The disease killed a massive portion of the population, particularly in urban centers like Constantinople. Contemporary sources claim that at its peak, thousands died each day in the capital alone. The demographic and economic effects were severe. Agricultural production fell, tax revenues declined, and the military found it harder to recruit soldiers. The plague, combined with the financial toll of wars and internal unrest, pushed the empire into a prolonged period of strain. When Justinian died in the year 565, he left behind a complex legacy. On one hand, he had expanded the empire to its greatest territorial reach in centuries. He had codified Roman law, patronized monumental architecture, and centralized imperial authority. On the other hand, his policies overstretched the empire's capacities, and many of the lands he reconquered would soon be lost again. The reign of Justinian marked both a high point and a breaking point for the Eastern Roman Empire. His conquests, legal reforms, and grand building projects reshaped the empire, but they also exposed its limits. By the mid-6th century, the Eastern Roman state was stretched thin, geographically, economically, and militarily. And as the emperor aged, new and overwhelming pressures began to bear down on the imperial system, from both within and without. The most immediate and devastating of these was the pandemic now known as the Plague of Justinian. First appearing around the year 541, the disease likely originated in Egypt and rapidly spread across the Mediterranean through trade routes. Constantinople, the heart of the empire, was especially hard hit. The contemporary historian Procopius, who served under Justinian, claimed that at its peak, the plague killed over 10,000 people a day in the capital. While this figure may be exaggerated, the scale of death was undeniably massive. Entire neighborhoods were emptied. Farmers could not tend fields. Soldiers could not be recruited. The state could not collect taxes. The human toll led to widespread economic and administrative collapse. Shortages of food and labor forced a reorganization of urban life and provincial governance. While Justinian himself survived the illness, the empire he ruled would never fully recover from the plague's shockwaves. Compounding this internal disaster were renewed external threats. In the Balkans, Slavic tribes and Avars, nomadic warriors from the Eurasian steppe, began to press against the empire's northern borders. With military resources redirected to campaigns in Italy and North Africa, and further depleted by disease, Byzantine control in these regions weakened. Fortresses were overrun, and raiding parties penetrated deeper into imperial territory. In the east, tensions with the Sassanid Persian Empire reignited. Though a temporary peace had been arranged earlier in Justinian's reign, the truce eventually dissolved. Under Khosrow I, Persia launched aggressive campaigns into Byzantine-held Syria and Armenia. The empire, already overwhelmed by the plague and under pressure from the north, now had to fight a costly two-front conflict. After Justinian's death in the year 565, his nephew Justin II ascended the throne. Lacking his predecessor's political foresight and surrounded by instability, Justin II struggled to manage the empire's fragile condition. He refused to continue the payment of tribute to Persia, a policy that had previously helped preserve peace, provoking a renewed war. His mental health reportedly declined in the face of constant military defeats, and he eventually withdrew from governance, appointing Tiberius as Caesar and then as co-emperor. Tiberius II reigned from the late 570s until his death in the year 582. He was a capable administrator who attempted to stabilize the empire, but the problems he inherited were too deeply rooted to solve quickly. The Avars and Slavs continued their incursions into the Balkans, reaching as far as the Greek heartlands. Meanwhile, the Persians maintained pressure on the Eastern Front. When Maurice became emperor in the year 582, he brought military experience and determination to the throne. Maurice reorganized the army and launched a series of campaigns that temporarily restored Byzantine authority in the Balkans. He also negotiated a peace with Persia that, for a brief period, gave the empire breathing room in the east. But Maurice's reign ended in tragedy. Attempting to reduce military costs, he ordered troops to winter beyond the Danube, away from home. The army, exhausted and angry, mutinied. In the year 602, Maurice was overthrown and executed, along with his family. A centurion named Phocas seized the throne, beginning one of the most brutal and unstable chapters in Byzantine political history. Phocas was widely regarded as a usurper and tyrant. His rule unleashed a wave of purges and violence in Constantinople. More importantly, it shattered the fragile peace with Persia. Khosrow II, now ruling Persia, claimed that he was acting in defense of the murdered Maurice and used the emperor's death as a pretext for war. Persian forces launched an unprecedented assault on Byzantine territories, sweeping through Mesopotamia, Syria, and eventually into Asia Minor itself. During this period, major cities such as Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria fell to Persian control. The loss of Jerusalem in particular had deep symbolic and religious consequences, as the city held immense significance for Christians across the empire. According to Byzantine sources, the Persians even carried away the true cross, one of Christianity's most venerated relics. The empire now faced collapse. The Balkans were effectively lost to Slavic migration and Avar raids. The east was overrun by Persia. Italy, still recovering from the earlier Gothic wars, was in disarray. The treasury was depleted, and the capital itself was under threat. In this moment of crisis, a new figure emerged: Heraclius. Heraclius was the son of the Exarch of Carthage, an imperial governor with significant autonomy in North Africa. In the year 610, Heraclius launched a naval expedition against Constantinople, deposed Phocas, and took the imperial throne for himself. The situation he inherited was dire, but Heraclius would go on to lead one of the most remarkable comebacks in imperial history. His early years on the throne were spent trying to reorganize the state. He overhauled the military structure, introduced new administrative systems, and personally led campaigns against the Persians. By adopting mobile tactics and striking deep into Persian territory, Heraclius changed the momentum of the war. In a series of campaigns between 622 and 628, he defeated several Persian armies and even captured the Persian capital, Ctesiphon. In the aftermath, Khosrow II was overthrown by his own generals, and a new peace was signed. The Byzantines regained Jerusalem, recovered many lost provinces, and restored the true cross to the Holy City. After nearly 2 decades of catastrophic war, the Eastern Roman Empire had survived and even achieved a stunning military victory. But it had come at a price. The empire was exhausted. Cities lay in ruins, agricultural lands had been ravaged, and the population had been drained by war and plague. Trade routes had been disrupted, and local economies across the eastern provinces were in crisis. Heraclius had saved the empire, but he had also pushed it to its absolute limits. When Heraclius seized the Byzantine throne in the year 610, the empire was teetering on the edge of collapse. The provinces of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt had been lost to the Persians. The Avars and Slavs continued their incursions into the Balkans, and the treasury had been nearly emptied by decades of war and internal instability. Yet despite this bleak landscape, Heraclius would go on to lead one of the most astonishing military and political recoveries in Roman history. But his triumphs, as impressive as they were, would be short-lived, overshadowed by the emergence of an entirely new force from the Arabian Peninsula. Heraclius was born in the late 6th century in Cappadocia, in what is now central Turkey. His father was the Exarch of Africa, governing Byzantine North Africa from Carthage. After the empire descended into chaos under the brutal reign of Phocas, Heraclius launched a naval expedition from Carthage and deposed the tyrant. Upon entering Constantinople, he was proclaimed emperor, inheriting a state fragmented, battered, and under siege. In the first years of his rule, Heraclius focused on reorganizing the empire's institutions. He reduced expenses, cut back on court extravagance, and introduced new administrative measures to stabilize the treasury. He reformed the military by developing the theme system, granting land to soldiers in exchange for hereditary military service. Though this system would become more influential in later centuries, its roots can be traced to Heraclius's reign. By the early 620s, Heraclius turned his attention back to the Eastern Front. The Sassanid Persians, under Khosrow II, had advanced deep into Byzantine territory. Jerusalem had fallen in the year 614, followed by the capture of Alexandria. The True Cross, Christianity's most sacred relic, had been carried off to Persia, and morale across the empire had plummeted. Heraclius, however, did not concede defeat. In a bold and risky move, he led a series of military campaigns between the years 622 and 628, penetrating deep into Persian territory. His strategy was unconventional. Rather than defending his remaining provinces, he struck directly at the Persian heartland, forcing Khosrow to divert his forces away from the conquered lands. In one of the most celebrated victories in Byzantine history, Heraclius's army defeated the Persians at the Battle of Nineveh in the year 627. Soon after, Heraclius advanced on Ctesiphon, the Persian capital. Khosrow was overthrown by his own generals and executed. His son, Kavad II, quickly sued for peace. The Byzantines recovered Jerusalem, restored many eastern provinces, and reclaimed the True Cross. In Constantinople, Heraclius was hailed as a second Constantine. Church bells rang, triumphal processions filled the streets, and the emperor personally returned the True Cross to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. After nearly 2 decades of brutal warfare, the empire had not only survived, but regained much of its former strength. Yet the cost of this victory was staggering. The eastern provinces had been devastated by constant campaigns. The countryside was depopulated, cities lay in ruins, and local economies had collapsed. The empire had drained its manpower, depleted its finances, and traumatized its population. While Heraclius had won the war, the empire was left weakened and vulnerable. And it was at this very moment, just as peace returned, that a new threat emerged from the south. In the Arabian Peninsula, a religious movement had taken root under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad. By the time of his death in the year 632, the tribes of Arabia had been unified under the banner of Islam. The new caliph, Abu Bakr, launched a series of campaigns beyond Arabia, driven by both religious zeal and the opportunity to challenge weakened empires to the north. By the mid-630s, Muslim armies had begun penetrating into Byzantine-held Syria. The Byzantines, still recovering from war and disease, were ill-prepared for a sustained conflict. The first major engagement occurred at the Battle of Ajnadain in the year 634, where the Byzantine army was decisively defeated. Heraclius, now in his 60s and increasingly ill, attempted to rally resistance. He moved the imperial court to Antioch and tried to coordinate defense among the eastern provinces. However, many local populations, particularly in Egypt and Syria, were disillusioned with imperial rule. Religious divisions, especially over the nature of Christ, had alienated large portions of the Christian population. These internal fractures would prove costly. In the year 636, the decisive Battle of Yarmouk was fought near the Yarmouk River in modern-day Jordan. The Byzantine forces, led by the general Vahan, faced a smaller but more mobile Muslim army commanded by Khalid ibn al-Walid. After several days of intense fighting, the Byzantines were routed. The loss was catastrophic. Following Yarmouk, Muslim forces quickly advanced through Syria and Palestine. Damascus fell, followed by Jerusalem in the year 637. The Muslim commander, Umar ibn al-Khattab, reportedly entered the city peacefully, and Christian holy sites were protected under the terms of surrender. While Heraclius had hoped to mount a counterattack, it became increasingly clear that the empire lacked the resources to retake the region. Heraclius withdrew to Constantinople and, according to some sources, reportedly lamented, "Farewell, Syria." It was a symbolic moment. The Eastern Roman Empire was acknowledging the loss of one of its oldest and most vital provinces. The city of Antioch, once a jewel of Roman Syria, was gone. The Holy Land, including Jerusalem, was under new rule. Egypt followed shortly thereafter. In the years 640 to 642, Muslim armies advanced through the Nile Delta. Byzantine resistance was sporadic and uncoordinated. Alexandria, the empire's second city and a major center of learning and trade, surrendered after a brief siege. With its loss, the empire was cut off from one of its richest provinces, once the granary of Rome. By the time of Heraclius's death in the year 641, the Eastern Roman Empire had suffered one of the most rapid and profound losses in its history. Within a single decade, the empire had lost Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and parts of Mesopotamia. These regions had been part of the Roman world for centuries. Yet, despite the scale of the losses, the empire did not collapse. Constantinople remained intact. Asia Minor, the Balkans, and parts of Armenia were still under imperial control. Heraclius had reorganized the military in ways that would allow future emperors to defend the remaining core of the empire more effectively. Culturally and religiously, Heraclius's reign also marked a transition. He promoted Greek as the empire's primary administrative language, further distancing the Eastern Roman identity from its Latin roots. He also attempted to heal religious divisions through the doctrine of monothelitism, an effort to reconcile the Chalcedonian and Monophysite factions. This attempt, however, largely failed and stirred further controversy. Heraclius remains a complex figure in Byzantine history. He was a brilliant strategist who rescued the empire from total collapse during the Persian Wars. Yet his triumph came just in time for an even more devastating challenge. His reign marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now divided. A new Islamic empire was rising, and Byzantium would have to find a way to survive in its shadow. By the middle of the 7th century, the Eastern Roman Empire had been transformed. Weakened by decades of warfare with Persia, ravaged by plague and worn down by internal divisions, it now faced a rising power from an unexpected direction, the Islamic Caliphate. What began as a series of raids from the Arabian Peninsula quickly developed into one of the most dramatic military expansions in world history. Following the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the year 632, the Islamic community, or Ummah, unified under a new political and religious leader, the Caliph. The first Caliph, Abu Bakr, directed the early Muslim community to continue the expansion that had begun during Muhammad's lifetime. His successor, Umar ibn al-Khattab, oversaw the dramatic conquests that followed. The Muslim armies were fast-moving, well-coordinated, and fueled by both religious motivation and tribal unity. But their success was not solely the result of zeal. The two great empires to the north, Byzantium and Persia, were deeply weakened. Persia, in particular, collapsed under the pressure. The Sassanid dynasty disintegrated by the middle of the century, and its lands became part of the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. The Byzantines, while still intact, were forced onto the defensive. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Mesopotamia had already been lost under Heraclius, but now the Caliphate continued to press forward. Under Caliph Uthman and then Caliph Ali, Muslim forces solidified control of the eastern Mediterranean coast and moved deeper into North Africa and Armenia. The Byzantines attempted to defend what remained. Emperor Constans II, who reigned from the early 600s to the late 600s, focused his efforts on military reorganization. He recognized that the old system, based on fixed provinces and long-distance administration, was no longer viable. In response, he formalized the theme system, a territorial and military reconfiguration that grouped land into military districts. Each theme was governed by a strategos, a military commander responsible for both civil and military administration. This system allowed for faster mobilization and better local defense, especially in Asia Minor. Though it would evolve over time, the theme system would remain central to Byzantine governance for centuries to come. It marked a decisive turn from the Roman imperial model toward a more localized and militarized structure. Despite these reforms, the military situation remained dire. In the year 654, the first Arab fleet, created under Caliph Muawiyah, launched naval raids against Cyprus and other Aegean islands. The Byzantine navy, though formidable, was now facing a determined and growing maritime rival. Then came the Great Siege. In the year 674, under the Umayyad Caliphate led by Muawiyah, the Arab forces launched a sustained attack on Constantinople itself. For several years they laid siege to the city during the warmer months, withdrawing each winter. The situation was critical. If the city fell, the empire would almost certainly collapse. But Constantinople, protected by its massive Theodosian walls and its strategic location, held firm. The Byzantines also deployed a powerful secret weapon, Greek fire. This incendiary substance, the exact composition of which remains unknown, could burn even on water and was launched from siphon-like devices mounted on ships. Greek fire devastated the Arab fleet and played a key role in lifting the siege in the year 678. The successful defense of Constantinople was a turning point. It did not reverse the losses the empire had suffered, but it prevented total collapse. It also had symbolic importance. The Christian empire had withstood the armies of Islam, preserving its capital and its religious identity. Following the failed siege, a 30-year truce was negotiated. This breathing space allowed the empire, under Emperor Constantine IV, to rebuild its defenses and continue internal reforms. However, the truce was not the end of Arab-Byzantine conflict. It was only a pause. In the meantime, the Islamic Caliphate continued its expansion westward across North Africa. Carthage, once a vital Byzantine stronghold in the Exarchate of Africa, fell in the late 7th century. From there, Muslim forces would eventually cross into the Iberian Peninsula, changing the map of Western Europe as well. In the east, the Muslim presence solidified in Armenia and the Caucasus. The border between the Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire hardened into a militarized frontier, often called the Thugger, where raids, skirmishes, and small wars would become a way of life for generations. The 7th century also saw changes within the empire itself. The Greek language, long dominant in the eastern provinces, was now fully replacing Latin in administration. Under the reign of Emperor Heraclius, official documents had begun to be issued in Greek. This linguistic shift reinforced the growing cultural divergence from the old Roman world. The empire still called itself Roman, but the Greek character of its bureaucracy, religion, and society was becoming more pronounced. Religiously, the empire was also under strain. The Monothelite doctrine, an attempt to reconcile the Chalcedonian and Monophysite factions by asserting that Christ had two natures but only one will, had failed to unify Christian opinion. Many Christians in Egypt, Syria, and Armenia remained deeply alienated from Constantinople. These divisions not only weakened internal cohesion, but also contributed to the population's willingness to accept new rulers when Arab armies arrived. By the early 8th century, the Umayyad Caliphate was preparing for a second attempt to conquer Constantinople. In the year 717, during the reign of Emperor Leo III, a massive Arab force launched another siege on the city. This time, the threat was even greater. The Caliphate brought a fleet and an army of considerable size, hoping to finish what had begun nearly half a century earlier. Once again, Constantinople's defenses held. The Byzantines used Greek fire, strong fortifications, and a well-organized defense to repel the attackers. In addition, a particularly harsh winter and the successful disruption of Arab supply lines contributed to the failure of the siege. After nearly a year, the Arab forces withdrew. The victory marked the end of large-scale Arab attempts to conquer the Byzantine capital. Following this second failed siege, the tide began to turn, gradually, in Byzantium's favor. The empire remained much smaller than it had once been, but it had adapted. The military and administrative changes introduced in the 7th century created a more flexible, resilient state. The Islamic Caliphate, too, began to face its own internal problems. Civil wars, succession disputes, and growing regional divisions began to slow the pace of its expansion. By the mid-8th century, the Byzantine Empire had survived the most aggressive phase of the Arab conquests. It had lost vast territories, but it had retained its capital, its religious institutions, and its identity. The Eastern Roman state had been forced to evolve, militarily, culturally, and theologically, but it had endured. By the early 8th century, the Byzantine Empire had stabilized its frontiers and withstood the most intense waves of Arab expansion. Its defenses had held firm through sieges, and the theme system had created a durable administrative and military structure. However, the greatest challenge of the next century would not come from foreign invaders, but from within, from a spiritual crisis that shook the foundations of Byzantine religious life and imperial authority. This was the age of iconoclasm. The word iconoclasm comes from the Greek for image breaking. At its heart, the iconoclastic controversy was a theological and political debate over the proper role of religious images, icons in Christian worship. For centuries, Christians in the Byzantine world had venerated painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints. Icons were displayed in churches, homes, and public spaces, and they played a central role in personal devotion and liturgy. But in the early 8th century, a dramatic shift occurred. In the year 726, Emperor Leo III issued an imperial edict banning the veneration of icons. This marked the official beginning of the first phase of Byzantine iconoclasm. The reasons behind Leo's decision are still debated by historians. Some argue that it was influenced by the growing power of Islam, which forbade the depiction of human figures in religious art. Others suggest that military defeats and natural disasters, such as volcanic eruptions and plagues, were interpreted as signs of divine displeasure, and the emperor believed that idol worship was to blame. It may also have been a move to assert imperial authority over the church and to reduce the influence of monastic communities, which were strongholds of icon veneration. Whatever the motivations, Leo's decree triggered fierce resistance, particularly from monks, clergy, and laypeople who saw icons as essential to the practice of faith. In some regions, riots broke out. Monasteries were attacked, churches were stripped of images, and prominent opponents of iconoclasm were exiled or executed. Leo's son, Constantine V, succeeded him in the year 741 and became one of the most forceful advocates of iconoclasm. Under his reign, the policy became more systematic. A church council held in Hieria in 754 condemned the veneration of icons as heresy and endorsed the emperor's position. Constantine V went further than his father by aggressively suppressing opposition. Monks, who had often led the defense of icons, suffered the most. Monasteries were closed, and many monks were imprisoned, tortured, or forcibly secularized. Religious art that depicted holy figures was replaced with purely ornamental or symbolic decoration. Imperial propaganda portrayed the iconoclasts as defenders of pure Christianity and linked their cause to military success and divine favor. Despite this official pressure, icon veneration did not disappear. In private homes, among the rural population, and in parts of the church hierarchy, devotion to icons persisted. The Western Christian world, especially the papacy in Rome, also rejected iconoclasm. This contributed to growing tensions between Constantinople and the Latin West, which were already strained by cultural and political differences. The first phase of iconoclasm continued until the death of Constantine V's son, Leo IV, in the year 780. His widow, Empress Irene, acted as regent for their young son, Constantine VI, and reversed the iconoclastic policies. Irene convened the Second Council of Nicaea in the year 787, which affirmed the veneration of icons as orthodox practice. This council is still regarded as the seventh ecumenical council by both Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. Irene's actions marked the end of the first iconoclastic period, but the controversy was far from over. Her rule was controversial, not only because she was a woman wielding imperial authority in a patriarchal society, but also because of her political intrigues. She eventually had her son blinded and took sole control of the empire. Though she maintained the restoration of icons, her reign was marked by instability. The second wave of iconoclasm began in the early 9th century, under the reign of Leo V. Citing military defeats as divine punishment, Leo reinstated iconoclasm in the year 815. This second phase was less violent than the first, but still led to persecution of iconodules, those who supported the veneration of icons. Leo V was assassinated in the year 820, but iconoclasm continued under his successors. It was not until the reign of Empress Theodora, acting as regent for her son Michael III, that iconoclasm was finally ended. In the year 843, Theodora formally restored the veneration of icons and declared an end to the controversy. This restoration is still celebrated annually in the Eastern Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy. The end of iconoclasm did more than resolve a theological debate. It also reaffirmed the role of images in Byzantine religious life and strengthened the authority of the monastic movement, which had resisted imperial interference in spiritual matters. Monasteries would become even more influential in the cultural and religious landscape of Byzantium, producing theological texts, preserving manuscripts, and shaping public piety. Politically, the iconoclastic controversy had weakened the empire in several ways. The harsh suppression of dissent had created internal divisions. The alienation of the Western Church widened the cultural and religious gulf between Constantinople and Rome. Perhaps most importantly, the energy and resources consumed by the internal conflict had distracted the empire from external threats. During the period of iconoclasm, Arab raids continued along the frontiers, and Sicily came under increasing Muslim pressure. The empire's position in the Mediterranean was gradually eroding. The Bulgars, to the north, also became a more organized and threatening force during this time. The final end of the iconoclast controversy in the year 843 marked more than just a theological resolution. It set the stage for a political and cultural transformation. As the Byzantine Empire emerged from over a century of religious upheaval, it entered a period of consolidation and renewed strength. This new direction would take shape under the leadership of one of the most unlikely emperors in its history, Basil I, founder of the Macedonian dynasty. Basil's rise to power is one of the more remarkable personal stories in Byzantine history. Born into a peasant family in the theme of Macedonia, which was located in Thrace, not the modern-day region of Macedonia, Basil was of Armenian descent. Orphaned at an early age, he reportedly worked as a stable hand before being noticed for his physical strength and intelligence. He eventually made his way to Constantinople, where he entered the imperial court and gained favor through a mix of charisma, ambition, and calculated loyalty. By the middle of the 9th century, Basil had become a prominent figure at court. He entered the service of Emperor Michael III, the last ruler of the Amorian dynasty, and rose rapidly through the ranks. His relationship with the emperor was unusually close. Basil was named co-emperor in the year 866, a move that shocked many in the imperial establishment. Only a year later, in 867, Michael III was assassinated, and Basil became sole emperor. Whether Basil was directly involved in the assassination remains debated, but his swift assumption of power was clear evidence of his political acumen. Once in power, Basil I set out to strengthen imperial institutions, restore the prestige of the throne, and consolidate the gains made since the end of iconoclasm. Though he had little formal education, Basil was deeply committed to reviving the classical and legal traditions of the empire. One of his major projects was the reform and codification of Byzantine law. He commissioned a new legal compilation known as the Basilica, a Greek revision and expansion of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. This legal code, written in the vernacular Greek of the time, made the law more accessible and served as a foundation for Byzantine jurisprudence for centuries. Basil also worked to improve the efficiency of the imperial bureaucracy. He reorganized administrative structures, reduced corruption, and placed capable individuals in key positions. While earlier emperors had often relied on court favorites or members of the aristocracy, Basil promoted officials based on merit. This allowed for more effective governance and helped restore public confidence in the imperial system. Religiously, Basil maintained the orthodox consensus established after the end of iconoclasm. He supported the power of the church, particularly the monastic movement, which had emerged as a cultural and spiritual force. Monasteries expanded their influence during his reign, contributing to education, art, and theology. Basil also supported missionary activity beyond the empire's borders, particularly among the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. One of the most lasting achievements of this missionary work was the conversion of the Bulgarians to Christianity. Although this process had begun under earlier emperors, it was under Basil's rule that the Christianization of Bulgaria became more firmly rooted. Byzantine missionaries helped establish a native Slavic clergy and promoted the use of the Glagolitic and Cyrillic alphabets, developed by Saints Cyril and Methodius, which would have a profound influence on Slavic culture and literacy. Militarily, Basil's reign was marked by defensive consolidation and targeted expansion. He inherited a stable frontier thanks to the efforts of earlier emperors and used this stability to fortify key border regions. In the east, he launched campaigns against Arab forces in Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia, achieving some limited successes. In the west, he worked to reassert control over southern Italy, where Byzantine authority had been eroding under pressure from both Arab and Frankish forces. Naval strength was also a focus of his military policy. The Byzantine fleet remained a crucial instrument of imperial defense, especially in the Aegean and eastern Mediterranean. While Basil did not lead major naval campaigns himself, he ensured that the empire's maritime defenses were well maintained, deterring large-scale Arab raids on the coastlines. Despite these achievements, Basil's rule was not without challenges. His legitimacy was questioned by some due to the circumstances of his rise to power. The memory of Michael III lingered, and some viewed Basil as a usurper. However, over time, his administrative success and public image helped secure his place as a legitimate and even beloved ruler. Basil was also known for his personal austerity and devotion to justice. He styled himself as a new David, a humble and righteous ruler chosen by God. This imagery helped contrast him with the perceived decadence and moral failures of the Amorian dynasty. Basil presented himself as a restorer of order and tradition, an image that resonated with both the aristocracy and the common people. One area where Basil's reign was less successful was in dynastic succession. He had several sons, but the legitimacy of his eldest, Leo, was complicated by rumors that he was not Basil's biological child, but rather the son of the late Michael III. Despite these doubts, Basil named Leo as his co-emperor in the year 869, attempting to secure the dynasty's future. The relationship between Basil and Leo was strained. Basil reportedly distrusted Leo and even imprisoned him for a time. Nonetheless, Leo would eventually succeed his father as Emperor Leo VI, also known as Leo the Wise. The tension between father and son reflected the broader difficulties of dynastic politics in Byzantium, where legitimacy, loyalty, and lineage were constantly contested. When Basil died in the year 886, he left behind a revitalized empire. The state was more centralized, the law more coherent, the church more unified, and the frontiers more secure. His reign marked the beginning of the Macedonian dynasty, which would rule the Byzantine Empire for nearly 2 centuries and preside over one of its most stable and culturally vibrant eras. Under Basil's successors, the empire would experience a period often referred to as the Macedonian Renaissance. Learning, literature, and the arts flourished, while the empire's military and political power steadily expanded. Basil's rise from peasant origins to the imperial throne had been improbable, but his impact was undeniable. He had set the foundation for a new era, one in which Byzantium, no longer consumed by internal division or immediate existential threats, could project power outward, revive classical learning, and become once more a central player in the politics of the medieval world. The accession of Basil I in the late 9th century marked the beginning of the Macedonian dynasty, and with it a profound revival of Byzantine power, culture, and learning. Over the course of the next century, the Eastern Roman Empire would not only stabilize and consolidate its territorial control, but also enjoy a cultural flourishing often referred to as the Macedonian Renaissance. This Renaissance was not a sudden explosion of innovation, but rather a deliberate return to classical ideals, administrative reform, religious unity, and artistic expression. Building upon the foundation laid by Basil I, his successors continued to refine imperial governance, improve military structures, and promote the study of ancient texts, all while projecting Byzantine influence beyond its traditional boundaries. After Basil's death in the year 886, his son Leo VI, known as Leo the Wise, took the throne. His reputation as a scholar and lawgiver helped to define the intellectual spirit of the age. Leo was a prolific writer and theologian, authoring works on military strategy, religious doctrine, and court ceremony. Most notably, he revised and expanded the legal code begun by his father, producing a legal corpus known as the Basilica, a major codification of Roman law translated into Greek and adapted for contemporary Byzantine society. Leo VI also strengthened the role of the emperor as both a secular and religious authority. He regularly intervened in ecclesiastical matters, sought to define church policy, and promoted the centrality of Constantinople in Orthodox Christianity. His personal life, however, created controversy. In an effort to secure a male heir, he married 4 times, violating established church canons. This led to a major dispute with the Patriarch Nicholas Mystikos and demonstrated the delicate balance between imperial power and religious tradition. Despite these tensions, Leo's reign was largely peaceful and marked by internal consolidation. His interest in scholarship encouraged the preservation and copying of classical Greek texts, many of which would have otherwise been lost to history. Under his patronage, scriptoria within monasteries and urban centers flourished. This revival of classical learning, blended with Christian theology, gave the Macedonian period its intellectual richness. Leo was succeeded by his brother Alexander, whose brief and ineffective reign was followed by a regency for Leo's young son, Constantine VII. Initially sidelined by powerful generals and court factions, Constantine eventually assumed full control and reigned as emperor from the early to mid-10th century. Known as Constantine Porphyrogenitos, or Born in the Purple, he was a staunch advocate of imperial tradition and ceremonial grandeur. Constantine VII oversaw one of the most culturally rich periods of the Byzantine Empire. His court became a center of learning and artistic patronage. He personally authored or commissioned several key works, including the De Administrando Imperio, a guide for ruling and diplomacy that detailed the customs, geography, and politics of neighboring peoples. This text reveals not only the empire's self-awareness, but also its complex relationship with the outside world. from the Slavs and Bulgars to the Arabs and Franks. The De Ceremoniis, another work attributed to Constantine, meticulously described imperial rituals and court etiquette, reinforcing the emperor's sacred status and the Byzantine court's theatrical splendor. These texts are invaluable records of medieval political thought and continue to shape modern understanding of Byzantine governance and diplomacy. Culturally, the visual arts flourished under Constantine and his successors. Mosaics, manuscripts, ivory carvings, and church architecture saw renewed attention. The mosaic decorations of churches such as Hagia Sophia in Constantinople were refurbished, emphasizing divine order and imperial authority. These works combined theological meaning with aesthetic sophistication, reflecting the confidence of an empire that once again saw itself as the center of a civilized world. Militarily, the 10th century was a time of offensive expansion. The empire's long-standing enemies, including the Arab Emirates in eastern Anatolia and northern Syria, were on the defensive. Byzantine armies, now under the leadership of capable generals like John Kourkouas and Nikephoros Phocas, launched systematic campaigns to recover lost territory. Under the reign of Romanos, the first Lekapenos, a naval officer who seized power as co-emperor during Constantine's minority, the empire began to gain ground in the east. These efforts continued under Constantine and culminated in the reconquest of key cities such as Melitene and Edessa. These victories not only restored imperial prestige, but also reopened trade routes and pilgrimage paths to the Holy Land. The expansion continued under Emperor Nikephoros II Phocas, a celebrated general who became emperor in the latter half of the 10th century. He spearheaded the reconquest of Crete from Arab pirates in the year 961, a major naval success that secured the eastern Mediterranean. He also led victorious campaigns in Syria, capturing the ancient city of Aleppo and extending Byzantine control deeper into the Levant. Nikephoros was a military innovator. He reformed the army, emphasized cavalry tactics, and promoted heavily armed infantry. His military manuals, such as the Precepta Militaria, reveal the strategic thinking of the era and influenced military doctrine well beyond his lifetime. Despite his military success, Nikephoros faced opposition at court. His ascetic lifestyle and strict fiscal policies made him unpopular among the aristocracy and the church. He was eventually assassinated in a palace coup led by his former comrade, John Tzimiskes, who became emperor in the year 969. John Tzimiskes continued the policy of eastern expansion. He campaigned deep into Mesopotamia and secured victories against both Arab and Bulgar forces. His reign balanced martial success with internal harmony, and he worked to reconcile court factions and ease tensions with the church. The reigns of these warrior emperors demonstrated a key feature of the Macedonian Renaissance. The empire was not merely defending itself, it was expanding, reforming, and asserting cultural leadership. The empire's boundaries grew, its cities prospered, and its institutions matured. Diplomatically, Byzantium held a commanding presence. Marriage alliances, such as those with the rulers of Kievan Rus and Armenia, extended Byzantine influence across Eurasia. At the same time, Christian missions sponsored by the empire reached into Eastern Europe. The conversion of the Rus in the late 10th century under Prince Vladimir of Kiev was influenced by Byzantine clergy and liturgical practice. The use of the Cyrillic script and Orthodox theology helped shape what would become the cultural foundation of Eastern Slavic Christianity. In the West, the empire remained wary of the Holy Roman Empire, particularly under rulers like Otto I. Though there were moments of diplomatic tension, Byzantium maintained its claim as the legitimate Roman Empire and continued to act as a central authority in the Christian world, even as the Latin West began to assert its independence. By the end of the 10th century, the Macedonian dynasty had brought the empire to a new height. It was politically stable, territorially secure, culturally vibrant, and diplomatically influential. The imperial capital, Constantinople, stood as the largest and most magnificent city in the Christian world, a beacon of wealth, order, and tradition. The Macedonian Renaissance, though grounded in a return to classical forms and religious orthodoxy, was not a mere imitation of the past. It was a confident expression of a uniquely Byzantine identity, one that saw itself as both Roman and Orthodox, imperial and sacred. By the final quarter of the 10th century, the Byzantine Empire had reached a level of strength, territorial control, and cultural refinement unmatched in centuries. Yet it was under Emperor Basil II that the empire would achieve its greatest military power and internal stability, culminating in what many consider the apex of the Eastern Roman state. His reign, long and turbulent, brought decisive victories, administrative consolidation, and lasting impacts, both positive and unintended. Basil II was born in the year 957 to Emperor Romanos II and Theophano. He was still a child when his father died, and real power during his early years was exercised by regents, including the military emperors Nikephoros II Phocas and John Tzimiskes. These warrior rulers preserved the empire's military momentum, but their deaths left young Basil at the mercy of the court elite, particularly the powerful eunuch Basil Lecapenus, who acted as de facto ruler during the early part of Basil's reign. When Basil formally became senior emperor in the year 976, he faced a situation far more precarious than it appeared on the surface. Though the empire was large and prosperous, the central authority of the emperor had been weakened by the growing power of the landed aristocracy. In provinces such as Anatolia and Armenia, wealthy families, many of military origin, had accumulated vast estates and commanded private armies. These magnates posed a quiet but significant challenge to imperial authority. From the very beginning of his rule, Basil II sought to restore absolute control. His first major obstacle was an internal rebellion led by Bardas Skleros, a powerful general who claimed the throne and rallied support in the eastern provinces. The rebellion lasted several years and gained considerable traction before Basil managed to crush it with the help of loyal forces, including a detachment of foreign mercenaries known as the Varangian Guard. Soon after, a second and even more dangerous rebellion emerged, led by Bardas Phocas, a member of the influential Phocas family and the nephew of the former emperor Nikephoros II. This revolt drew upon the widespread discontent of the aristocracy and nearly succeeded in dividing the empire. However, Basil proved both determined and ruthless. After years of conflict, Bardas Phocas was defeated and killed in battle, and Basil moved swiftly to break the political influence of the great landowning families. His victory over these internal threats marked a turning point. For the first time in generations, the emperor reasserted direct control over the provinces. Basil implemented tax reforms to reclaim state revenues that had been lost to private landholders, and he reinforced imperial authority over regional governors. These measures did not end aristocratic power, but they curtailed its political ambitions and allowed Basil to centralize the imperial administration. With his domestic position secure, Basil turned his attention to foreign policy, particularly the long-standing conflict with the Bulgarians. The Bulgarian Empire, located to the north of the Byzantine Balkans, had been a thorn in the side of Constantinople for centuries. During the 9th and early 10th centuries, under Tsar Simeon and his successors, the Bulgarians had posed a serious threat to Byzantine control in the region. Relations had been tense, and previous emperors had failed to bring the region fully under control. Basil II was determined to change that. What followed was a series of campaigns spanning over 2 decades as Basil relentlessly waged war against Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria. The terrain was difficult, and Bulgarian resistance was fierce. Rather than a single decisive engagement, the conflict consisted of repeated sieges, skirmishes, and slow attrition. Despite early setbacks, including a major defeat at the gates of Trajan, Basil gradually gained the upper hand. He reorganized the army, strengthened supply lines, and ensured discipline among his troops. His persistence and strategic planning eventually paid off. In the year 1001, Basil captured the Bulgarian capital of Ohrid. Over the next several years, he conducted methodical campaigns that reduced Bulgarian fortresses one by one. The decisive moment came in the year 1014 at the Battle of Clydion, where Basil trapped and annihilated a large Bulgarian army. According to later Byzantine sources, Basil ordered the surviving prisoners, said to number in the thousands, to be blinded, leaving one man in every 100 with one eye to guide the others home. When Tsar Samuel saw his mutilated soldiers return, he reportedly died of shock. Though this story may be embellished, the effect of the battle was undeniable. Bulgarian resistance collapsed shortly thereafter, and by the year 1018, the entire Bulgarian Empire had been annexed into the Byzantine realm. Basil earned the epithet Bulgar Slayer, or Bulgaroktonos, for his role in this conquest. This victory not only removed a long-standing rival, but also extended Byzantine authority deep into the Balkans. It allowed for the integration of Bulgarian territory, administration, and population into the imperial system. The annexation brought new revenue and manpower and secured Byzantium's northern frontier for a generation. Basil also conducted campaigns in the east. He reasserted Byzantine influence over parts of Armenia and Georgia, using a combination of military force and diplomatic marriages. His goal was not only expansion, but also the stabilization of the empire's eastern borderlands, where rival powers and tribal confederations frequently disrupted trade and security. Throughout his reign, Basil maintained a strong personal grip on the army. He spent much of his time on campaign rather than in Constantinople, earning the loyalty of his soldiers and ensuring that the army remained under imperial, not aristocratic, control. Unlike many of his predecessors, Basil avoided luxury and court extravagance. He lived simply, took no wife, and fathered no children. His focus was the state, and he ruled it with discipline and resolve. Basil's reign also coincided with continued cultural growth, carried over from the Macedonian Renaissance. Though not personally a scholar like his predecessor Constantine VII, Basil patronized church construction, manuscript preservation, and monastic life. He supported the Orthodox Church and maintained religious orthodoxy, continuing the legacy of doctrinal clarity established after iconoclasm. By the time of his death in the year 1025, Basil II had ruled for nearly 5 decades. His reign was the longest of any Byzantine emperor and one of the most consequential. The empire's borders stretched from the Adriatic Sea in the west to the Euphrates River in the east, and from the Danube River in the north to the Mediterranean in the south. Internal stability, fiscal health, and military dominance defined the state he left behind. And yet, this very strength masked emerging vulnerabilities. Basil's centralization of power meant that his successors inherited an empire highly dependent on his personal authority. With no direct heir, the throne passed to his brother Constantine VIII, an aging and politically inexperienced man. The discipline and unity that had characterized Basil's rule would not be maintained by those who followed. The death of Basil II in the year 1025 left the Byzantine Empire at the height of its territorial expansion and internal stability. Yet, beneath this apparent strength lay a significant structural vulnerability: the absence of a clear and capable successor. Basil's long reign had ensured continuity, discipline, and central authority, but his failure to marry or produce heirs left a vacuum that would rapidly destabilize the empire's foundations. The throne passed to Basil's brother, Constantine VIII, a man in his 60s with little interest in governance. Unlike his brother, Constantine had spent most of his life indulging in courtly pleasures rather than military campaigns or administrative affairs. Though he nominally held the title of co-emperor during Basil's reign, he played no serious role in policy or leadership. When he became sole emperor, his rule was marked by political complacency and a lack of vision. Constantine ruled for only a few years before his death in the year 1028. In an effort to secure the succession, he arranged the marriage of his daughter Zoe to Romanos Argyros, a nobleman of distinguished background who then became Emperor Romanos III. This marked the beginning of a pattern that would define the next decades. Emperors coming to power not by inheritance or conquest, but through marriage into the ruling family or political maneuvering. Zoe, along with her sister Theodora, would play a central role in Byzantine politics during this period. Though women were formally excluded from military command or administrative office, empresses could wield immense influence through court alliances and dynastic arrangements. Zoe's personal life, including multiple marriages and dramatic palace intrigues, came to symbolize the instability of the imperial court in the mid-11th century. Romanos III, Zoe's first husband, attempted to continue the legacy of strong imperial leadership. He pursued military campaigns in the east, particularly against Muslim emirates in Syria, but these efforts met with mixed results. In the year 1030, his army suffered a humiliating defeat at Azaz, and Romanos returned to Constantinople with diminished prestige. His economic policies also failed to contain the growing influence of the aristocracy, who were reclaiming land and weakening the fiscal strength of the state. Romanos's personal relationship with Zoe deteriorated over time, and in the year 1034, he died under suspicious circumstances. Rumors of poisoning circulated, and not long after, Zoe married her chamberlain, who became Emperor Michael IV. His reign, though short, introduced some reforms and military activity, but real power was increasingly concentrated in the hands of his brother, John the Orphan Atrophos, a court official who dominated imperial administration. Michael IV's rule saw renewed conflict with Bulgaria, which had been fully annexed under Basil II. A large-scale revolt erupted in the early 1040s, led by a charismatic leader named Peter Delian. Though the rebellion was eventually suppressed, it exposed the fragility of Byzantine control in the Balkans and the limits of imperial authority outside of Constantinople. Michael IV died in the year 1041 and was succeeded by his nephew, Michael V, a ruler with grand ambitions but little political support. In a shocking move, Michael exiled Empress Zoe, sparking a popular uprising in the capital. The people of Constantinople stormed the imperial palace, and Zoe was restored to the throne alongside her sister, Theodora. For a brief period, the empire was ruled jointly by two empresses, an extraordinary moment in Byzantine history. Eventually, Zoe married a third time, this time to Constantine Monomachos, who reigned as Constantine IX. His long rule brought a measure of temporary stability, but the deeper problems of imperial governance remained unresolved. Constantine was more interested in patronage, luxury, and theological disputes than in military readiness or economic reform. During his reign, the Byzantine navy was neglected, and the army underwent a process of slow decline. Mercenary forces replaced the professional army, and strategic provinces were left vulnerable. At the same time, the empire faced renewed tensions with the Latin West. In the year 1054, a formal split between the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic churches occurred, the Great Schism. Though doctrinal differences had existed for centuries, the mutual excommunications issued by the Patriarch of Constantinople and the papal legates formalized the divide. This ecclesiastical rupture would have lasting political consequences, weakening Byzantine relations with Western powers, just as new threats emerged from the East. Perhaps the most significant of these threats was the rise of the Seljuk Turks. Originating from Central Asia, the Seljuks had converted to Islam and quickly established themselves as a dominant military force in Persia and the Eastern Islamic world. By the mid-11th century, they began pressing into Byzantine Anatolia, challenging imperial authority in a region that had long served as the heartland of Byzantine military and economic power. The Byzantine response to the Seljuk advance was inconsistent. The military apparatus was no longer the formidable force it had been under Basil II. Internal court politics often took precedence over strategic planning, and the reliance on foreign mercenaries eroded the effectiveness of the army. In this context of mounting crisis, the throne passed to Romanos IV Diogenes in the year 1068. A soldier by background, Romanos sought to reverse the empire's decline through military reform and a major campaign against the Seljuks. His efforts culminated in one of the most disastrous events in Byzantine history, the Battle of Manzikert. Fought in the year 1071 near Lake Van in eastern Anatolia, the Battle of Manzikert pitted the Byzantine army against the Seljuk forces under Sultan Alp Arslan. Romanos led a large force into hostile territory, hoping to halt the Turkish advance and reassert imperial strength. But the campaign was poorly coordinated. Disunity among Romanos's commanders, betrayal by key allies, and logistical failures weakened the army. During the battle, a portion of the Byzantine forces, led by Andronikos Doukas, a rival political faction, abandoned the field. The resulting confusion allowed the Seljuks to encircle and defeat the Byzantines. Romanos was captured by Alp Arslan, who, according to some sources, treated him with unexpected courtesy and released him after negotiating terms. Despite his release, Romanos returned to a hostile political environment in Constantinople. He was quickly overthrown, blinded, and exiled. His defeat at Manzikert had already unleashed chaos in Anatolia. The loss was not just a battlefield setback. It marked the beginning of a full-scale Turkish migration into Byzantine territory. Within a few years, large swaths of Asia Minor fell under Turkish control. Manzikert exposed the fragility of the Byzantine state in the face of internal division and external challenge. What Basil II had built was unraveling. The disciplined, centralized empire had given way to factionalism, military weakness, and dynastic instability. The consequences would be far-reaching. The Battle of Manzikert, fought in the year 1071, was one of the most devastating defeats in Byzantine history. More than just a lost battle, it marked a fundamental shift in the empire's geopolitical position. The aftermath of Manzikert triggered the collapse of Byzantine authority in Anatolia, the empire's core region, and opened the floodgates for Turkish expansion into Roman territory. The defeat also intensified political fragmentation within the empire, setting the stage for a prolonged era of instability, opportunism, and civil war. To understand the full impact of Manzikert, it is important to consider the strategic and symbolic importance of Anatolia. For centuries, this region had served as the empire's heartland. It provided food, soldiers, and revenue. Most of the empire's military themes, administrative and defensive districts, were based in Anatolia. Its population was largely Greek-speaking, Orthodox Christian, and loyal to Constantinople. Losing this region would be akin to losing the very foundation of the empire. The man who led the Byzantine army into the ill-fated campaign at Manzikert was Romanos IV Diogenes. A member of the military aristocracy, Romanos had come to power during a period of dynastic crisis. Although he lacked legitimacy by birth, he married into the ruling Doukas family and assumed the throne with the support of factions at court who hoped he would restore order to the army and counter the growing Turkish threat. Romanos was aware that the Seljuk Turks, under the leadership of Sultan Alp Arslan, had been conducting increasingly bold raids into eastern Anatolia. These incursions, though often seasonal and limited in scope, were beginning to displace local populations and undermine imperial control. Romanos resolved to take decisive action. He assembled a large army, drawing from the imperial guard, provincial troops, mercenaries from the west, and allied contingents from Armenia and Georgia. But while the army was large on paper, it was far from cohesive. Many of the troops were inexperienced or poorly disciplined. The elite Varangian Guard remained loyal, but other elements of the army were politically divided. The most dangerous internal threat came from Andronikos Doukas, a member of the powerful Doukas family and the commander of the army's rear guard. He deeply resented Romanos and had no interest in supporting his success. Romanos marched east toward the fortress of Manzikert, located near Lake Van, in what is now eastern Turkey. His initial plan was to split his forces, sending a detachment to secure a nearby town while advancing with the main body toward the Seljuk positions. This division of forces proved to be a grave mistake. Alp Arslan, informed of the Byzantine movements, mobilized his army with speed and precision. He struck Romanos before the Byzantines could regroup. On the day of the battle, Romanos deployed his forces in the traditional formation with a central body and flanking wings. At first, the Byzantines held their ground. The Seljuk Turks, using their trademark mobility and mounted archery, harassed the flanks but avoided full engagement. As the day wore on, Romanos ordered a general advance. The Turks began a feigned retreat, drawing the Byzantines deeper into unfamiliar terrain. Then the trap was sprung. The Seljuks counterattacked, surrounding the Byzantine forces. At the critical moment, the rearguard under Andronikos Doukas refused to support the main body, and according to some sources, may have actively betrayed Romanos by spreading rumors of his death and retreating from the field. This act of treachery sealed the fate of the Byzantine army. Romanos fought valiantly, but was eventually captured. The Emperor of the Romans, once considered the supreme ruler of the Christian world, found himself a prisoner of the Seljuk Sultan. Yet, in an ironic twist, Alp Arslan treated his captive with remarkable generosity. The two men reportedly held a civil exchange, and the Sultan, recognizing the political value of a peaceful arrangement, released Romanos after a few days, having secured a promise of ransom and diplomatic concessions. Romanos's return to Constantinople, however, was far from triumphant. His political enemies had already moved against him. Upon his arrival, he was deposed, blinded, and exiled to a monastery where he later died from his injuries. The betrayal of Romanos and the failure to defend the eastern provinces had irreversible consequences. The military catastrophe at Manzikert was not simply a battlefield defeat. It shattered Byzantine confidence and triggered the collapse of imperial authority in Anatolia. With no strong emperor to lead the state and the army in disarray, Turkish tribes began to move into the vacuum left by the Byzantines. Entire cities and towns fell without a fight. Local Byzantine officials either fled or submitted to the newcomers. Within a few years, the Turks had established permanent settlements across much of central Anatolia. These groups, loosely affiliated with the Seljuks, formed the basis of what would later become the Sultanate of Rum, a Turkish Muslim state occupying former Byzantine lands. Although Constantinople retained nominal control over the coasts and some urban centers, the interior was effectively lost. The demographic and economic consequences of this loss were profound. Anatolia had supplied the empire with a large proportion of its tax revenue, agricultural output, and military manpower. Losing it not only weakened the empire's economy, but also disrupted the recruitment of native soldiers. Increasingly, the empire would become reliant on foreign mercenaries and unstable alliances. Culturally and psychologically, the loss of Anatolia was equally damaging. For centuries, Byzantium had considered itself the defender of Orthodox Christianity and the civilized world. The fall of major cities and sacred sites to Muslim powers challenged this self-image. Monasteries were abandoned, pilgrimage routes were cut off, and refugees flooded into western Anatolia and Constantinople, placing strain on already limited resources. The aristocracy, particularly the military families of Anatolia, also suffered. Many lost their estates, fortresses, and retainers. This sudden shift in the balance of power allowed the court bureaucracy and urban elite in Constantinople to assert more control, but without the military strength needed to defend the empire. A disconnect emerged between the capital and the provinces, further weakening the imperial structure. In the decades that followed, the empire spiraled into a series of civil wars and palace coups. Competing factions vied for power, and no single emperor was able to restore lasting order. Some attempted reforms. Others pursued temporary alliances with foreign powers, including the Normans and Pechenegs, but none could recover the core territories lost after Manzikert. The broader world was also changing. In Western Europe, the papacy was growing more assertive, and the idea of religious warfare was gaining traction. Reports of Christian suffering in the East, combined with ambitions to assert Latin dominance, would soon coalesce into a new and unexpected movement: the Crusades. Ironically, it would be the empire's own call for help, issued by Emperor Alexios I Komnenos in the face of Turkish pressure, that would bring Western armies into the Byzantine sphere. But those armies would come with their own ambitions, creating new complications for an empire already struggling to survive. Thus, Manzikert was not just the loss of a battle, it was the beginning of a transformation. The Byzantine Empire, still calling itself Roman, now faced a radically altered political landscape. Its heartland had been pierced, its military prestige shattered, and its unity dissolved. The centuries ahead would be marked by survival, adaptation, and at times, desperate attempts at revival. In the wake of the catastrophic defeat at Manzikert and the resulting collapse of imperial authority in Anatolia, the Byzantine Empire teetered on the edge of dissolution. Civil wars, palace coups, and the rise of Turkish emirates across the former Roman heartland had undermined the empire's position in the eastern Mediterranean. But in the midst of this crisis, one man would rise to restore a measure of stability, revive imperial administration, and reshape Byzantium's place in the medieval world. That man was Alexios Komnenos. Alexios came from the powerful Komnenos family, one of the few remaining aristocratic houses with deep roots in the military aristocracy. After years of internal disorder, he seized the throne in the year 1081, marking the beginning of the Comnenian dynasty. His accession did not come through straightforward succession, but through a combination of military influence, court intrigue, and family alliances. Alexios inherited an empire that was militarily fractured, economically depleted, and politically isolated. The treasury was nearly empty, the army was weakened, and the Turks controlled the majority of Asia Minor. From the beginning of his reign, Alexios faced challenges on all fronts. In the west, the Normans, led by Robert Guiscard, invaded Byzantine territories in the Balkans. These were the same Normans who had recently conquered southern Italy and Sicily, establishing a powerful presence in the region. Their ambitions now extended into Greece and beyond. Alexios, lacking sufficient native troops, turned to diplomacy and hired foreign mercenaries to repel the Norman invasion. He also secured an alliance with the German Emperor Henry IV, who pressured the Normans from the west, forcing them to retreat. In the north, Alexios faced renewed threats from the Pechenegs, a semi-nomadic Turkic people who launched devastating raids into the empire's Danubian provinces. These attacks culminated in a major battle near the city of Livigno, where Alexios, with the support of his newly organized army and Varangian Guard, won a decisive victory. This triumph helped secure the Balkan frontier and allowed the emperor to redirect his attention to the more critical front in the east. But it was the loss of Anatolia, the empire's ancient heartland, that remained Alexios's greatest concern. The Seljuk Turks had carved out a new polity known as the Sultanate of Rum, centered in former Byzantine territory. Though some border fortresses remained under imperial control, the vast interior had fallen under Turkish rule, and the Christian population had either fled or come under new administration. Alexios understood that to reclaim these lands, he needed more than mercenaries or defensive campaigns. He needed allies. Thus, in a move that would have far-reaching consequences, Alexios sent envoys to the west, specifically to Pope Urban II, requesting military assistance to help repel the Turkish threat and recover lost territory. The appeal was strategic. Alexios presented the crisis as a threat to all of Christendom, framing the Turks as enemies of the Christian world and emphasizing the plight of Eastern Christians under Muslim rule. The Pope, eager to assert leadership over a unified Christendom and perhaps to heal the schism between East and West, responded with enthusiasm. At the Council of Clermont in the year 1095, Pope Urban issued a call to arms. The goal, as he framed it, was to aid the Christians of the East and liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control. What followed was a mass mobilization across Western Europe, the First Crusade. From Alexios's perspective, the First Crusade was both an opportunity and a risk. He had hoped for small, disciplined military aid from the West, but what arrived was a massive, disorganized wave of armed pilgrims, knights, and opportunists, all driven by a mix of piety, ambition, and desperation. The initial wave, known as the People's Crusade, was led by charismatic preachers like Peter the Hermit and lacked discipline or leadership. This group caused chaos as it passed through the Balkans, pillaging Byzantine towns and clashing with local populations. Alexios, though frustrated, managed to escort them across the Bosporus into Asia Minor, where they were swiftly annihilated by the Turks. The second wave, however, was different. Led by seasoned nobles such as Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, and Godfrey of Bouillon, the main crusading armies were better equipped and more organized. Upon their arrival in Constantinople, Alexios demanded oaths of fealty and promises that any recovered Byzantine lands would be returned to imperial control. Most of the leaders agreed, though the sincerity of these pledges would soon be tested. As the Crusaders advanced into Anatolia, they successfully recaptured key cities, including Nicaea, which was returned to imperial control. Their victories against the Turks reopened parts of Western Asia Minor to Byzantine administration. Encouraged by these gains, Alexios cautiously followed behind the crusading forces, re-establishing garrisons and restoring some degree of order. However, tensions between the Byzantines and Crusaders escalated. The Crusaders saw themselves as independent agents of divine mission, not vassals of the emperor. Byzantine officers viewed many of the Westerners as unruly, arrogant, and dangerously unpredictable. These mutual suspicions deepened as the Crusaders advanced beyond Byzantine interests, pushing into Syria and eventually laying siege to Antioch and Jerusalem. Though the Crusades' military achievements were remarkable, the capture of Jerusalem in the year 1099 being the most celebrated, its legacy for Byzantium was mixed. On one hand, Alexios had recovered significant territory in Asia Minor, restoring a measure of imperial strength in the region. On the other hand, the Crusaders established a series of Latin states in the Levant, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Antioch, which operated independently and sometimes in direct conflict with Byzantine goals. The establishment of these Latin states created new political complications. Rather than becoming reliable allies, the Crusader lords frequently challenged Byzantine claims to overlordship and operated as rival powers. In particular, Bohemond of Taranto seized Antioch for himself and refused to hand it over to the empire, despite his earlier oath. This betrayal would haunt Byzantine-Latin relations for decades. Alexios responded to these developments with diplomatic pragmatism. He avoided open conflict with the Crusader states, but sought to expand Byzantine influence through treaties and strategic marriages. He also focused on rebuilding imperial institutions. His administration reformed the tax system, revived the currency, and encouraged the revival of trade and urban life. The capital, Constantinople, once again became a thriving center of commerce and learning. By the end of his reign, Alexios had restored the empire from the brink of collapse. He had fended off external threats, reasserted control over parts of Anatolia, and restructured the state to face the challenges of a changing world. Yet, the empire he passed on to his son John Komnenos was not the same empire that Basil II had ruled. The Comnenian system of government was based heavily on family alliances, patronage, and a semi-feudal arrangement with the aristocracy. While this created short-term stability, it also tied imperial power to the fortunes of a single family. Furthermore, the involvement of Western powers in the Eastern Mediterranean had created a new political reality, one in which Byzantium could no longer claim undisputed dominance in the Christian world. Still, Alexios Komnenos had achieved what many thought impossible. He had held the empire together, resisted invasions, and turned the First Crusade to his advantage, at least in the short term. His reign marked a turning point, the beginning of a Comnenian revival that would carry Byzantium through much of the 12th century. The reign of Alexios Komnenos had saved the Byzantine Empire from collapse. By the time of his death in the early 12th century, he had regained control over key portions of Anatolia, restored order to imperial administration, and reasserted Byzantium's relevance on the world stage. His policies and legacy passed to his son, John II Komnenos, who continued the dynasty's cautious recovery of territory and prestige. But as the Comnenian period progressed, it became increasingly clear that the restoration had limits. Despite the outward strength and cultural vibrancy of the empire during the 12th century, serious underlying weaknesses began to re-emerge. John II Komnenos inherited the throne in a relatively smooth transition, an achievement in itself considering the violent nature of many imperial successions in Byzantine history. His reign, which lasted for over 2 decades, was marked by consistency, discipline, and a strong sense of imperial duty. Unlike his father, who had relied heavily on political intrigue and diplomatic manipulation, John was known for his personal austerity, humility, and deep religiosity. Militarily, John II focused on continued campaigns in Anatolia and the Balkans. He sought to reclaim lost cities from the Turkish Sultanate of Rum and to secure the Danube frontier from incursions by nomadic tribes. His most ambitious efforts took place in Cilicia and northern Syria, where he attempted to bring crusader states under Byzantine influence. In a series of carefully planned campaigns, he exerted pressure on the Principality of Antioch, attempting to force its leaders to recognize Byzantine overlordship. Though John II achieved several military victories and diplomatic gains, his ambitions were curtailed by the limits of Byzantine power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Crusader lords were not easily controlled, and the growing independence of Western powers in the Levant made it clear that Byzantium could not dictate affairs as it once had. Still, John's reign restored confidence in the throne, stabilized the eastern frontier, and brought about a period of relative peace and prosperity. John II died unexpectedly during a hunting accident, leaving the throne to his youngest son, Manuel I Comnenus. Known for his charisma, energy, and imperial ambition, Manuel represented the most outwardly confident expression of the Comnenian restoration. His reign was defined by an assertive foreign policy, increased contact with Western Europe, and the extension of Byzantine influence beyond traditional boundaries. Manuel had been educated in a court atmosphere shaped by Latin customs and was deeply fascinated by Western chivalry, diplomacy, and warfare. This cultural affinity shaped many of his political decisions. He married a Frankish princess, invited Western knights to serve in his armies, and participated in tournaments and courtly displays inspired by Western traditions. At times, he seemed to envision Byzantium as not merely the heir to Rome, but as the unifying force of Christendom. One of his most ambitious foreign ventures was in Italy. Seeking to reassert Byzantine claims in the south, Manuel launched a campaign to recover territories once held by the empire. Though initially successful, the effort ultimately failed due to stiff resistance from the Normans and the logistical difficulties of sustaining long-distance operations. Even so, the campaign demonstrated the emperor's expansive vision. In the Balkans, Manuel achieved more concrete success. He maintained dominance over Hungary for a period through both war and diplomacy and managed to keep the Serbs and other regional powers in check. His court became a diplomatic hub, hosting ambassadors from across Europe and the Muslim world. Constantinople during Manuel's reign was a dazzling city, cosmopolitan, wealthy, and filled with art, architecture, and scholarly activity. Yet, behind the grandeur lay growing tensions. Manuel's military adventures placed enormous strain on the imperial treasury. He expanded the army by increasing reliance on mercenaries, many of them Western knights, whose loyalty depended entirely on payment. The traditional themes system, once the backbone of Byzantine defense, had been hollowed out, and native recruitment had sharply declined. The imperial administration, though sophisticated, had become increasingly dependent on a narrow elite connected to the Komnenos family through marriage and patronage. This centralization of power around the Comnenian dynasty created a politically insular court that lacked broader support among the provincial aristocracy. Many of the empire's landed magnates, particularly in Asia Minor and the Balkans, felt excluded from real influence. While Alexios, John, and Manuel had maintained a careful balance, their successors would struggle to hold it together. Manuel's reign ended with the Battle of Myriokephalon in the late 12th century, where the Byzantines suffered a defeat at the hands of the Seljuk Turks. Though the battle was not a total disaster, it marked the symbolic end of Byzantine ambitions to reconquer the Anatolian interior. The vision of fully reversing the consequences of Manzikert faded. The empire would now focus on defending its frontiers rather than expanding them. Following Manuel's death, the empire entered a period of steady decline. His son, Alexios II, was only a child when he inherited the throne, and real power fell into the hands of regents. The court became a battleground for factions, and a new round of palace intrigue began to dominate political life. The empire's rivals seized the opportunity. The Hungarians, Seljuks, and Sicilian Normans all renewed their pressure on Byzantine borders. In a particularly violent episode, a usurper named Andronikos Komnenos seized power, promising to purge the corrupt court and restore justice. Initially welcomed by the people for his populist rhetoric, Andronikos soon revealed himself as a ruthless autocrat. His regime, marked by terror and executions, alienated both the aristocracy and the common people. He was eventually overthrown and killed in a brutal uprising in Constantinople. The collapse of the Comnenian regime marked a turning point. With no strong dynasty in place, the imperial government fragmented. Subsequent emperors lacked both legitimacy and effectiveness. The central authority of the state deteriorated, and regions that had once been firmly under imperial control began to assert greater autonomy. Meanwhile, a new and dangerous force was gathering strength in the West. The Crusader movement, once viewed as a temporary expedition, had matured into a permanent presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Latin states in the Levant operated independently, and relations between Byzantium and the Latin West continued to sour. Religious differences, political distrust, and cultural hostility deepened the divide. Latin merchants, particularly those from Venice and Genoa, dominated trade in the empire, enriching themselves while bypassing Byzantine customs and undermining local economies. By the end of the 12th century, Constantinople remained a grand and populous city, but the empire around it had grown fragile. The Comnenian Restoration had brought an era of outward strength, diplomatic prestige, and cultural brilliance. However, it had also masked internal fragility. Its reliance on charismatic leadership, foreign mercenaries, and dynastic control created a system that could not easily survive beyond the family that built it. By the dawn of the 13th century, the Byzantine Empire stood weakened and divided. The Comnenian Restoration had brought a brief return to strength, but that era was over. The imperial court was fractured, the economy increasingly dominated by foreign merchants, and trust between Byzantium and the Latin West had deteriorated beyond repair. Into this volatile environment came a disaster of unparalleled scale, the Fourth Crusade. Intended to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, it would instead result in the sack of Constantinople by Western Christians in one of the most shocking betrayals in medieval history. The origins of the Fourth Crusade lay in familiar territory, the desire of the papacy to reclaim Jerusalem. After the loss of the city to Saladin in the late 12th century, Pope Innocent III issued a call for a new crusade. Unlike previous crusades, this one was to be a coordinated, disciplined effort. The goal was to strike Egypt, which was then the center of Muslim power in the region, and use it as a base for reclaiming the Holy Land. The plan required naval transport, and for that, the Crusaders turned to Venice. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, agreed to provide ships for the journey, but at a steep price. When the Crusaders failed to gather the necessary funds, the Venetians proposed an alternative form of payment: assistance in capturing the Christian city of Zara, a rebellious former Venetian colony on the Dalmatian coast. Despite papal condemnation, the Crusaders agreed. In doing so, they set a precedent that would haunt the rest of the campaign, using a religious mission to pursue political and economic goals, even at the expense of fellow Christians. While the Crusaders were encamped in Zara, a new opportunity presented itself. Representatives of a Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, arrived with an astonishing proposal. Alexios was the son of the deposed Byzantine emperor Isaac II, who had been blinded and overthrown by his brother Alexios III. The younger Alexios offered the Crusaders money, military support, and the promise of church reunion under papal authority, if they helped him reclaim his father's throne in Constantinople. The offer was too tempting for the Crusaders and Venetians to resist. The possibility of solving their financial problems, gaining a foothold in the East, and enforcing Latin Christianity on the Orthodox world gave them powerful incentives. The crusade, originally aimed at Egypt, now changed course toward Constantinople. In the summer of the year 1203, the Crusader fleet appeared before the walls of the Byzantine capital. The city was unprepared. Emperor Alexios III, despite the strength of the Theodosian walls, had lost the support of the people and the military. After a brief siege and limited fighting, he fled the city, leaving it defenseless. The Crusaders installed Alexios IV and his restored father, Isaac II, as co-emperors. But almost immediately, the alliance began to unravel. Alexios IV could not deliver the extravagant promises he had made: huge payments, military assistance, and the union of the churches. The Byzantine population resented the presence of the Latin armies and viewed the new emperor as a puppet of foreign invaders. Anti-Latin riots broke out in the capital, and tensions escalated. In early 1204, a palace coup led by a nobleman named Alexios Doukas, nicknamed Mortsouphlos, overthrew and executed Alexios IV. Isaac II died soon after, possibly from natural causes or neglect. Mortsouphlos declared himself Emperor Alexios V and attempted to defend the city against the enraged crusaders, who now had no political or financial incentive to remain peaceful. With diplomacy exhausted, the crusaders prepared for war. In April of the year 1204, after several failed attempts, the crusaders breached the sea walls of Constantinople. The attack was coordinated from both land and sea. Venetian ships broke through the harbor defenses, while land forces exploited weaknesses in the outer walls. After intense fighting, the crusaders stormed into the city. What followed was a catastrophe unlike any in Byzantine history. For 3 days, Constantinople, the largest, richest, and most sacred Christian city in the world, was subjected to looting, destruction, and desecration. Churches were plundered, sacred relics stolen or destroyed, and monasteries burned. The Hagia Sophia, the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity, was defiled. Horses were stabled in the nave, and drunken soldiers looted its treasures. Nuns were assaulted, and citizens slaughtered. Latin chroniclers acknowledged the violence with discomfort, while Byzantine sources recorded it with outrage and horror. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was not just a military defeat, it was a cultural and psychological trauma. Priceless manuscripts, artworks, and relics were lost forever or scattered across Western Europe. The city that had withstood countless sieges from Persians, Arabs, and Slavs had now fallen to fellow Christians. In the aftermath, the Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople. Baldwin of Flanders was crowned emperor, and a Latin patriarch was installed in the Hagia Sophia. Western lords divided the empire among themselves, carving up former Byzantine territories into feudal principalities modeled after Western Europe. Venice took control of key ports and islands, solidifying its commercial dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. The remnants of the Byzantine aristocracy and clergy fled. But even in this darkest moment, Byzantium did not completely die. 3 successor states quickly emerged, claiming the mantle of imperial legitimacy. The Empire of Nicaea, founded by Theodore Lascaris in Western Asia Minor, became the most prominent. The Despotate of Epirus in the Western Balkans and the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast also asserted continuity with the Byzantine tradition. These states maintained Orthodox Christianity, preserved aspects of Byzantine administration, and launched efforts to recover lost lands. The Latin Empire, meanwhile, struggled to survive. Despite initial hopes, it lacked the administrative capacity, local legitimacy, and resources to rule effectively. Resistance from the Greek population remained constant, and the empire's territory steadily shrank. The sack of Constantinople marked the lowest point in Byzantine history. It shattered the illusion of Christian unity, deepened the schism between East and West, and left a wound that would never fully heal. It also revealed the fundamental vulnerability of the empire, its dependence on diplomacy, its fractured political structure, and the corrosive effects of internal division. The sack of Constantinople in the year 1204 had left the Byzantine world in fragments. With the Latin Empire established in the heart of what had once been the most prestigious Christian city in the world, many assumed that the Eastern Roman Empire was finished. Yet the Byzantine tradition did not disappear. It merely relocated, restructured, and prepared for return. In exile, a handful of successor states rose to carry the legacy of Byzantium forward. Chief among them was the Empire of Nicaea, which would eventually lead the effort to recapture Constantinople and re-establish Byzantine rule. In the immediate aftermath of the sack, three primary Byzantine successor states emerged: the Despotate of Epirus in the Western Balkans, the Empire of Trebizond along the southeastern coast of the Black Sea, and the Empire of Nicaea in Western Asia Minor. Of these, the Empire of Nicaea, founded by Theodore I Lascaris, quickly proved to be the most organized and politically stable. Theodore, a son-in-law of the former Emperor Alexios III, had escaped the fall of Constantinople and established his court in the city of Nicaea, a strategically located and defensible city not far from the old capital. With Constantinople under Latin control, Theodore proclaimed himself emperor, setting in motion the Nicaean claim to imperial legitimacy. He consolidated local support, organized a functioning bureaucracy, and established a new patriarchate, ensuring religious continuity and orthodox identity. The early years of the Empire of Nicaea were spent resisting both Latin encroachment from the west and Seljuk Turkish pressure from the east. Theodore proved a capable ruler, forging alliances and building a professional military structure. He maintained good relations with the Orthodox Church, and by re-establishing a legitimate patriarch in Nicaea, he strengthened the spiritual authority of his regime. Under his leadership, Nicaea expanded its control in northwestern Anatolia and gradually became the primary refuge for Greek-speaking elites, clergy, and scholars displaced from Constantinople. Schools, monasteries, and libraries were founded or rebuilt, ensuring that the intellectual life of Byzantium would not be extinguished. Upon Theodore's death in the early 13th century, the empire passed to his son-in-law, John III Ducas Vatatzes. John III would prove to be one of the most important figures in the long road back to Constantinople. His reign marked a period of administrative consolidation, military expansion, and cultural revival. He skillfully negotiated with rival Greek states and Western powers alike, often using diplomacy as effectively as warfare. One of John's most significant accomplishments was the systematic recovery of territory in Western Asia Minor and parts of Thrace. He used both military pressure and alliances to reduce the influence of the Latin Empire and limit the ambitions of Epirus and Trebizond. He also forged trade agreements with Western European powers such as Genoa and Venice, ensuring access to necessary goods while avoiding outright confrontation. Culturally, John III encouraged a revival of learning and orthodox scholarship. He supported theological debate, the copying of manuscripts, and the establishment of schools. The Patriarchate in Nicaea continued to function as the spiritual center of the Orthodox world, reinforcing the idea that while Constantinople was under Latin occupation, the true empire lived on in exile. After John III's death, his son Theodore II Lascaris took the throne. Educated, intellectually inclined, and deeply committed to the empire's moral and cultural revival, Theodore emphasized scholarship and justice. He viewed the empire not only as a political entity, but as a civilizing force, one rooted in Orthodox values and Roman traditions. However, Theodore's reign was short and troubled by internal aristocratic opposition. Upon his death, the throne passed to his young son, John IV. Real power, however, was soon seized by a military commander and nobleman named Michael Palaiologos, who positioned himself as the protector of the young emperor. In time, Michael would eclipse the Lascaris dynasty entirely and lead the final assault on Constantinople. Michael maneuvered swiftly. In the year 1058, he was crowned co-emperor as Michael VIII. Despite his official role as regent, it was clear that he had no intention of sharing power indefinitely. He dealt ruthlessly with rivals, sidelined the Lascaris family, and consolidated control over both the military and administration. While politics unfolded within the empire, events outside of Nicaea provided a critical opportunity. The Latin Empire in Constantinople had never been strong. It had struggled from the beginning with insufficient manpower, financial instability, and hostility from both the native Greek population and external enemies. The Latin emperors were forced to rely heavily on Venetian naval power and Western mercenaries. Their control rarely extended beyond the immediate region surrounding Constantinople, and much of the countryside had reverted to local control or fallen into the hands of Greek or Bulgarian rulers. By the mid-13th century, the Latin Empire was in crisis. Its resources were exhausted, and it faced growing pressure from Nicaea, Epirus, and Bulgarian forces. In this context, Michael VIII saw his chance. In the year 1261, a Byzantine force under the general Alexios Strategopoulos was dispatched to monitor the situation near Constantinople. What they found was a city weakly defended. Most of the Latin forces had been sent away on campaign. Acting without direct orders, Alexios launched a surprise attack. Byzantine troops entered the city through a poorly defended gate and quickly overwhelmed the garrison. The return of the Byzantines to Constantinople was nearly bloodless. The Latin emperor fled, and the city's population welcomed the Greek soldiers with cautious relief. Within days, Michael VIII entered the city in triumph. After more than half a century in exile, the Byzantines had retaken their ancient capital. Michael was crowned emperor in Hagia Sophia, marking the restoration of the Byzantine Empire. The event was momentous, but the city he entered was no longer the Constantinople of old. The Latin occupation had left the city impoverished and partially ruined. Churches had been desecrated or repurposed, palaces looted, and infrastructure neglected. What remained of the once grand capital was a shadow of its former glory. Michael VIII understood both the symbolic and practical challenges of rebuilding the empire. He moved quickly to re-establish central authority, revitalize Constantinople, and assert Byzantine legitimacy on the international stage. However, the road ahead was steep. The restored empire was smaller, poorer, and more vulnerable than the one that had existed before the Fourth Crusade. The recapture of Constantinople in the year 1261 marked the official restoration of the Byzantine Empire under the Palaeologan dynasty. Michael VIII, Palaiologos, the architect of the city's return to imperial hands, stood triumphant in Hagia Sophia, recrowned as emperor in a city that had endured 6 decades of Latin occupation. Yet the victory, as symbolic as it was, did not mark the beginning of a new golden age. Rather, it heralded the final act of the Byzantine Empire, a slow, painful decline marked by internal division, economic weakness, and the rise of powerful new adversaries. Michael VIII had reclaimed Constantinople, but in doing so, he had overextended his resources and alienated key allies. His path to the throne included the blinding and imprisonment of the rightful heir, John IV Lascaris, a boy of legitimate lineage from the Nicaean imperial family. This brutal act horrified many in the Orthodox world and cast a shadow over Michael's legitimacy. Though he restored the capital, he inherited an empire that was far smaller and far weaker than its predecessors. Rebuilding Constantinople became Michael's top priority. The city had been looted, depopulated, and neglected during the Latin period. Churches were in ruins, aqueducts broken, and markets empty. Michael directed funds to repair the city's infrastructure, refortify the walls, and re-establish state institutions. However, the empire's treasury was already overstretched. To finance both reconstruction and military defense, Michael imposed heavy taxes and confiscated church properties, decisions that provoked further unrest among both clergy and common citizens. Externally, the empire was encircled by hostile powers. The Latin principalities in Greece, the Kingdom of Sicily under Charles of Anjou, and the expanding powers of the Serbs and Bulgarians all posed threats. Michael tried to hold these enemies at bay through diplomacy and strategic alliances. One of his most controversial moves was his attempt to reconcile the Orthodox Church with the Roman Catholic Church at the Second Council of Lyon in the year 1274. Under pressure from the papacy and seeking to prevent a Latin military invasion, Michael agreed to submit to papal authority and to reunify the churches, at least in form. The union was deeply unpopular in Constantinople and the Orthodox East. It was seen as a betrayal of faith, and many bishops, monks, and lay people openly resisted it. Although it may have brought temporary diplomatic relief, it damaged Michael's standing at home and contributed to unrest throughout his reign. After Michael's death, his son Andronicos II inherited an empire still reeling from decades of war, occupation, and fiscal strain. Andronicos attempted reforms, including reducing military expenses and relying more heavily on diplomacy. He disbanded the empire's small but effective navy to save money, an act that would prove disastrous, as it left the Aegean vulnerable to piracy and reduced Byzantine influence at sea. Throughout his long reign, Andronicos II struggled with internal revolts and external threats. The most dangerous came from the west, where the Serbian kingdom under Stefan Dušan rose to become a dominant force in the Balkans. In Anatolia, the weakening of imperial authority allowed Turkish beyliks, small frontier principalities, to expand into former Byzantine territory. Among them was a new power centered in the town of Seljuk, the Ottomans. The Ottomans began as a minor frontier emirate, but quickly grew in strength under their dynamic leadership. Their combination of religious zeal, military organization, and effective leadership allowed them to absorb neighboring territories and draw in warriors from across the region. As Byzantine control in Anatolia collapsed, the Ottomans advanced toward the Bosporus. Meanwhile, Byzantium descended into civil war. A bitter succession crisis broke out between Andronicos II and his grandson, Andronicos III. This internal conflict dragged on for years and devastated what little remained of the empire's economy and army. Eventually, Andronicos III emerged victorious and attempted to reverse the empire's decline. During his reign, Andronicos III made serious efforts to revive imperial authority. He rebuilt a small navy, improved judicial administration, and attempted to stabilize finances. Most notably, he worked closely with his friend and advisor John Cantacuzénos, who would later become a key political figure. Yet despite these efforts, the structural problems remained. After the death of Andronicos III, another civil war erupted, this time between John Cantacuzénos and the regency of the young emperor John V Palaiologos. The conflict lasted for years and invited foreign intervention from nearly every surrounding power, including the Ottomans. This period marked the true beginning of Ottoman involvement in Byzantine affairs. Initially, allies of Cantacuzénos, Ottoman forces were invited across the Bosporus to support his side in the civil war. This marked the first Ottoman military presence in Europe, and it would not be the last. What began as a temporary alliance soon gave way to permanent settlement. By the mid-14th century, the Ottomans had crossed into Thrace and captured the vital city of Adrianople, which they renamed Edirne. From there, they launched raids deeper into the Balkans and effectively surrounded Constantinople. The Byzantines, with no money, no army, and no allies willing to commit large forces, were powerless to stop them. Desperate for assistance, the emperors of Byzantium turned once again to the west. John V Palaiologos traveled to Rome and, in the year 1039, formally submitted to the Pope, accepting the authority of the Roman Catholic Church in hopes of securing military aid. The response from Western Europe was minimal. While some aid trickled in, it was never enough to counter the growing Ottoman threat. Over the next several decades, the empire continued to shrink. The Black Death struck Constantinople and its remaining territories, killing a large portion of the population and further weakening economic productivity. The remaining provinces in Greece and the Aegean fell under the influence or control of Venice, Genoa, or local warlords. Despite the decline, cultural life in Constantinople experienced a modest revival during these final years. The city remained a center of Orthodox theology, philosophical debate, and artistic production. Scholars continued to work in monasteries and schools, copying ancient texts and contributing to the intellectual traditions that would later influence the European Renaissance. By the beginning of the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was reduced to little more than Constantinople itself and a few scattered holdings in the Peloponnese. The Ottomans, now the dominant power in the region, tightened their grip. In one of the most desperate acts of its final decades, the empire once again agreed to a church union at the Council of Florence in the year 1439. The move, deeply unpopular at home, was an attempt to rally Western support against the Ottomans. But the West had its own concerns. While individual knights and small expeditions arrived, there was no unified response from the Catholic powers of Europe. The Byzantine Empire stood alone. Still, it did not fall quietly. The final emperors, including John VIII and his successor Constantine XI Palaiologos, continued to rule with dignity and resolve. Constantine, the last Roman emperor, prepared the city's defenses, maintained diplomatic efforts, and sought alliances wherever he could find them. On the morning of May 29th in the year 1453, the city of Constantinople, the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years, fell to the armies of the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II. With its collapse came the end of what had begun in antiquity as the Roman Empire, transformed into the Byzantine Empire, and endured as a unique fusion of Roman law, Hellenistic culture, and Orthodox Christianity. The fall of Constantinople was more than the capture of a city. It was the final act in one of history's longest and most remarkable imperial stories. In the years leading up to the siege, Constantinople was a shadow of its former self. The once grand capital, home to emperors, scholars, and saints, had been reduced to a walled city with a population likely numbering only in the tens of thousands. Much of its urban space had become ruralized. Churches lay in partial ruin, aqueducts no longer functioned, and large swaths of land inside the Theodosian walls were given over to agriculture. The reigning emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, was fully aware of the threat facing his city. Since the Ottomans had captured Adrianople, their presence in Europe had only expanded. Sultan Mehmed II, who had ascended the Ottoman throne at a young age, was ambitious, intelligent, and determined to conquer Constantinople. He understood the symbolic and strategic importance of the city, not only as a gateway between Europe and Asia, but as a prize that would validate his role as a new Caesar. Constantine knew he could not hold the city alone. Over the years, successive emperors had appealed to Western Europe for help, offering religious union with the papacy in return. At the Council of Florence, the Byzantine delegation had formally accepted union with the Roman Church. But the response in Constantinople was bitterly divided. The Orthodox clergy, monastic communities, and much of the population rejected the compromise, viewing it as a betrayal of their faith. Nevertheless, Constantine maintained the union in the hopes of Western aid. Some did come, though not enough to turn the tide. A small contingent of Genoese soldiers, led by the experienced commander Giovanni Giustiniani, arrived in the city. A few hundred more troops, including adventurers from various parts of Europe, also joined the defense. But the bulk of the defense still relied on the city's dwindling population and poorly equipped militias. In contrast, Mehmed II assembled a massive and modern army. Estimates vary, but it likely numbered in the tens of thousands, including elite janissaries, irregular cavalry, and siege engineers. One of the most decisive elements was the use of gunpowder artillery. Mehmed had commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to build some of the largest cannons seen in the world up to that point. These massive bombards would be used to pound the walls of Constantinople relentlessly. The siege began in early April of the year 1453. Mehmed's forces surrounded the city by land and sea. The Ottomans built a fleet to block the Bosporus and laid siege lines around the Theodosian walls. The defenders, outnumbered and isolated, had few choices. Constantine XI led from the front, organizing defenses and boosting morale. Justiniani and his men held key positions along the land walls, particularly at the vulnerable sections near the gates. The Ottoman bombardment began shortly after their arrival. Day after day, the massive cannons hurled stone projectiles at the walls. Sections of the defenses were reduced to rubble, hastily rebuilt at night by the defenders. The double and triple layers of walls, designed centuries earlier, proved remarkably resilient. But the psychological toll of constant shelling began to weigh heavily. Despite their superior numbers and firepower, the Ottomans faced difficulties. The defenders launched daring sorties to destroy siege engines and harass the besiegers. At sea, the Byzantine and Genoese ships initially held their own. In a remarkable maneuver, the defenders used a massive chain to block the Golden Horn, preventing Ottoman ships from entering the harbor. But Mehmed responded with a feat of engineering. His men built a wooden roadway over land, rolling ships on greased logs past Galata and into the Golden Horn. When the defenders awoke to find an Ottoman fleet in the harbor, their naval advantage was gone. The noose around the city tightened. For over 50 days, the siege dragged on. Inside the city, food and supplies ran low. Panic and desperation spread. Yet Constantine refused to surrender. He knew what the conquest of Constantinople would mean, not just for his city, but for Orthodox Christianity, for Roman identity, and for the long legacy of his imperial ancestors. On the night of May 28th, a final liturgy was held in Hagia Sophia. It was a moment of sorrow, unity, and resignation. Greek and Latin Christians, divided for centuries, stood side by side in prayer. Emperor Constantine is said to have received communion alongside his soldiers and citizens before returning to the walls for what he likely knew would be the last time. At dawn on May 29th, Mehmed launched his final assault. Waves of Ottoman soldiers attacked the crumbling walls. The defenders resisted with everything they had, but their lines buckled under the pressure. Justinian was wounded and carried away, causing a collapse in morale at a critical section of the defense. Ottoman forces poured through breaches, overwhelming the remaining resistance. Constantine XI fought to the end. According to later accounts, he removed his imperial regalia and charged into battle, dying anonymously alongside his soldiers. His body was never definitively identified, and legends soon spread that he would one day return to reclaim the city. Mehmed II entered Constantinople later that day. He ordered his men to stop the looting, entered Hagia Sophia, and offered prayers. The great church, once the spiritual heart of the Byzantine world, was converted into a mosque. The city, though battered, was spared further destruction by Mehmed's relatively restrained policy compared to previous sacks in history. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through the Christian world. In Western Europe, it was received with disbelief and mourning, but no major military response followed. The Byzantine Empire, which had outlived the Western Roman Empire by nearly 1,000 years, was no more. Yet the legacy of Byzantium did not vanish. The Orthodox Church survived under Ottoman rule, with the ecumenical patriarch retaining religious authority for Orthodox Christians in the empire. Byzantine scholars, fleeing the city in the years before and after its fall, carried ancient manuscripts and classical knowledge to Western Europe, contributing to the intellectual awakening that would become the Renaissance. The city of Constantinople itself, renamed Istanbul, would become the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. Mehmed II, now styled the Conqueror, envisioned himself as heir to the Roman Caesars. In his court, Roman traditions were absorbed and adapted, blending with Turkish and Islamic governance. As for the memory of Byzantium, it lived on. In the architecture of Russian cathedrals, in the liturgy of Eastern Orthodox churches, in the laws and customs of Balkan lands, and in the ideals of empire and faith that shaped generations to come. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of an empire, but not the end of its influence. From its beginnings in the eastern half of the Roman world, through centuries of war, faith, crisis, and recovery, the Byzantine Empire had endured against all odds. It preserved classical knowledge, developed unique forms of Christian thought, and stood as a cultural and political bridge between the ancient and the modern, between East and West. It was not just an empire of marble and mosaics, but of ideas and identity. And though the city fell, the legacy of Byzantium continues to echo in the annals of world history. Annals of world history.